looks aren't everything, or so Rodney Dangerfield spent a lifetime telling us. But behind the bulging eyes, the tugged red tie, and the perfectly timed one-liners was a man whose entire comedic identity was forged in genuine pain. The world knew him as the king of self-deprecation, but the real story of Rodney Dangerfield is far more complex, far darker, and ultimately far more inspiring than any punchline he ever delivered. Long before he was Rodney Dangerfield, he was Jacob Cohen, born in 1921 in Babylon, New York, into a world that offered him very little warmth. His father, a vaudevillian performer named Phil Roy, was barely a presence in his life, appearing only twice a year before disappearing again. His Hungarian-born mother, Dorothy, was emotionally distant, withholding the kind of affection that a growing boy desperately needs. Jacob grew up in the shadow of the Great Depression, desperately poor, working odd jobs just to keep the lights on while most kids his age were worrying about nothing more serious than school. Because his mother was so detached, Jacob spent most of his childhood wandering the streets of his neighborhood completely unsupervised. In his autobiography, It's Not Easy Being Me, he recounts a chilling memory from when he was just 5 years old. A man approached him and offered him a nickel, a small fortune for a hungry, lonely child, just to sit on his lap. Jacob sat there while the man held and kissed him, completely unaware of the predatory nature of what was happening. He even went back several times chasing those nickels because there was no one at home to tell him any better. Later in life, Rodney would use his signature dark humor to reference the incident, but the punchline was always a mask for a deep and lingering wound. He ended the story with a heartbreaking jab at his mother's absence. "Thanks for looking after me, Ma." For decades, audiences laughed at Rodney's self-deprecating humor without fully understanding that the no-respect routine wasn't just a clever gimmick. It was his lived reality from the very beginning. He admitted that his early traumas could have turned him into a bitter, angry person, but he chose a different path. He took all that childhood abandonment, the poverty, and the quiet suffering of his youth, and transformed it into fuel. Fuel that would eventually make the entire world laugh. 9 years of silence. By the time he was 15, Jacob Cohen was already writing jokes for professional comedians. At 19, he legally changed his name to Jack Roy, hoping for a fresh start in comedy. But the world wasn't ready for him. For 9 grueling years, he faced every indignity a performer can endure, eventually working as a singing waiter until he was fired from even that. With a wife and family to support and no spotlight in sight, he walked away from show business entirely and took a job selling aluminum siding. He later joked that he was so unknown that when he quit, he was the only one who knew he had left. But the itch to perform never fully went away. By the early 1960s, while still working as a salesman, he decided to give it one last shot, returning to small stages in the Catskill Mountains resort hotels. Success, however, remained elusive. He was drowning in $20,000 of debt and couldn't even get booked at decent clubs. He famously quipped that he played one venue so far out in the woods that his act was reviewed in Field and Stream. The breakthrough came when he finally stopped trying to be the cool guy on stage and started leaning into the failure itself. He needed a new name to go along with his new persona. During a comeback bid at the Inwood Lounge in Manhattan, he asked the club owner for a name, any name, to hide his identity from old patrons who remembered him as a flop. The owner suggested Rodney Dangerfield, a name that had popped up previously on old radio shows and sitcoms. It was a strange name, Rodney thought at first, but it stuck. And under that new mask, Jack Roy finally found his voice. The rise to stardom. Everything changed in March 1967 when Rodney appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. Audiences didn't just laugh, they recognized themselves in this sweating, nervous man who couldn't catch a break. Suddenly, he was a superstar. He became a fixture on the Las Vegas Strip, a regular on The Dean Martin Show, and eventually made over 70 appearances on The Tonight Show. To sustain the momentum without the grinding travel, he opened his own club in New York City, simply called Dangerfield's, which became a launching pad for the next generation of comedy legends, including Jerry Seinfeld, Jim Carrey, and Sam Kinison. In 1980, his comedy album No Respect won a Grammy. He even became a pioneer in the early days of MTV, with his song Rappin' Rodney becoming one of the first rap records to hit the Hot 100. The music video featured him being treated with so little respect that even the gates of heaven shut in his face, a joke everyone was in on, but one that always carried a grain of truth. His big screen explosion came with the 1980 comedy classic Caddyshack, where he played Al Chervik, an obnoxious, loudmouthed property developer opposite Chevy Chase and Bill Murray. Rodney improvised so many brilliant lines that his role kept expanding, much to the annoyance of some of his more traditional castmates. Critics and fans agreed. The guy who got no respect had become the king of the country club. More hit films followed, including Easy Money and Back to School, where his on-screen persona interestingly flipped. On stage, he was a loser. On screen, he played confident, successful man whom only the snobbish elite couldn't appreciate. Audiences loved watching him win. A double life and a dark chapter. What most fans never knew was that beneath all the fame and the laughter, Rodney had a past he was desperately running from. In the mid-1950s, long before the red tie became his uniform, he was still Jack Roy, broke, frustrated, and pressured by his wife at the time to abandon comedy and find a real job. Depressed and desperate, he made a choice that nearly ended everything. In 1955, federal agents launched a series of pre-dawn raids, arresting a group of men accused of running a massive $600,000 home repair scam. The scheme involved pretending to be war veterans selling cheap repairs to unsuspecting homeowners. One of the men indicted was Jack Roy. The charges were eventually dropped, and he walked away without a prison sentence, but his reputation was in ruins. He needed a clean slate, a new identity, and a reason to believe he could start over. Rodney Dangerfield was that reason. Even at the height of his fame, trouble found him. In 1988, a malfunctioning steam bath in his suite at Caesar's Palace caused a serious eye injury. When the hotel refused to compensate him for the 5 shows he missed while recovering, Rodney walked out on a packed house, told the audience to get their money back, and filed a $5 million lawsuit. After a heated legal battle, a jury sided with him and awarded him $725,000. In true Rodney fashion, he celebrated by taking his talents directly across the street to perform at a rival hotel. Love, loss, and a complicated heart. Rodney's personal life was just as turbulent as his career. In 1949, he married a singer named Joyce Indig, and both of them gave up their careers to try to build a normal life together. They had 2 children, Brian and Melanie, but the relationship couldn't hold. They divorced in 1962, remarried just a year later, and divorced again in 1970, a cycle of conflict and connection that mirrored the chaos of Rodney's early years. When Joyce passed away in 1975, Rodney was left to raise their children alone in his Manhattan apartment. He stepped up quietly and without fanfare, living a grounded, private life with his kids. He remained single for years until a random walk into a Santa Monica flower shop in 1983 changed everything. There he met Joan Child, and the two built a slow, steady relationship, dating for a full decade before finally marrying in 1993. Joan became his rock, his partner, and eventually the fierce protector of his legacy. The final curtain. By the time Rodney reached his later years, his body was paying the price for a lifetime of excess. He carried 3 different packs of cigarettes at a time and joked that he rewarded himself for not smoking by having a smoke. He had battled clinical depression for most of his adult life, admitting in his autobiography that he went through a 2-year stretch where he simply couldn't function, lying in bed for days, unable to face the world. By the end of his life, he was taking more than 100 pills a day just to keep going. For decades, he also maintained a daily marijuana habit, which he described as his greatest love affair, and which he continued right up to the end, even smoking in his hospital room. The cracks finally showed publicly in 2001, on his 80th birthday, when Jay Leno noticed during a Tonight Show performance that something was wrong. Rodney was suffering a mild stroke on live television. In true form, he was back on the same stage just a year later. But the real battle began in 2003 with brain surgery, followed by a risky heart valve replacement. As he entered UCLA Medical Center for that final surgery in 2004, a nurse asked how long he'd be staying. Without missing a beat, he replied, "If all goes well, about a week. If not, about an hour and a half." He slipped into a coma following the surgery. His wife, Joan, knowing him better than anyone, asked the nursing staff to show him a raunchy cartoon he loved. Remarkably, the laughter that had defined his entire life brought him back to consciousness. He woke up for a few more weeks, long enough to say his goodbyes before passing away on October 5th, 2004 at the age of 82. In a twist that felt almost scripted, the joke of the day, randomly selected for his website, that very morning was about him buying a cemetery plot with the salesman saying, "There goes the neighborhood." Joan knew it was the perfect parting shot. She had those words carved onto his headstone in Westwood Village. At his memorial, the word respect was written in the sky, while friends released monarch butterflies into the air, a beautiful tribute to a man who had spent 82 years convincing the world he was a loser, all while becoming one of the most genuinely respected figures in the history of American comedy. Rodney Dangerfield didn't just tell jokes. He showed us that even when life refuses to give you respect, you can still leave them laughing until the very last light goes out.